Hey everybody, my name is Sean Flynn, and this is my Cap 2, The Fate of Lactate. So when talking about lactate pathways, as glucose enters the body and is in the presence of sufficient oxygen, it'll travel through an aerobic pathway, which we went over in Cap 1. And so it'll head down the chain, convert to pyruvate, enter the mitochondria, which will then become acetyl-CoA, through the citric acid cycle, and through the electron transport change, and we get a plentiful amount of ATP. And this is great during light to moderate physical activity when oxygen is sufficient and the lactate is produced and removed at the same rate. However, during intense physical activity or when activities continually become more and more intense and oxygen is insufficient, the pyruvate cannot enter the mitochondria. So to continue through the aerobic pathway because it needs oxygen. So instead, it'll travel through an anaerobic pathway known as the Cori cycle. Lactate in our book is labeled as a valuable waste product, and lactate should not be viewed as a metabolic waste. It is actually the opposite. Lactate can provide a valuable source of chemical energy that occurs during intense physical activities and when oxygen is not sufficient. So as we enter the Cori cycle here, as you can see, there's glucose in the muscle. As the glucose turns into pyruvate and there's no oxygen, some excess hydrogen, two excess hydrogens will latch onto the pyruvate, and this creates the lactate. And this process is called the lactate hydrogenase. From there, our lactate then enters the bloodstream. It leaves the skeletal muscle and into the bloodstream, and it travels into the liver. Once into the liver, we lose the two hydrogens that were gained, and the lactate becomes pyruvate again, in which case, with the leftover NADH, we will gain some ATP before the pyruvate is turned back into glucose. This process that occurs in the liver when the lactate becomes pyruvate and then back to glucose is called gluconeogenesis, and this takes place in the liver again. Once converted back to glucose, the glucose re-enters the bloodstream and enters the skeletal muscle, and the cycle repeats. The great thing, and our bodies are so efficient, it's amazing, but the lactate can just keep going through the cycle and provide us energy when oxygen is not sufficient. So, with lactate accumulation occurs when exercise intensity increases to the point that muscle cells can no longer oxidize the lactate at a fast enough rate. So, as lactate's being formed, if our body cannot oxidize it, we have an accumulation of it. In untrained individuals, blood lactate starts to accumulate and rise in an exponential manner at about 50 to 55% of the individual's maximal aerobic capacity. However, in trained endurance athletes, blood lactate starts to accumulate at 80 to 90% of their maximal aerobic capacity. And so different fibers, type 1 versus type 2, different levels of trained athletes, everyone's lactate threshold is different, and the accumulation can be delayed to 80 to 90% of their maximal aerobic capacity, or in a complete untrained individual, 50 to 55%. And we will get into that later in adaptations. So the consequences of lactate accumulation. Lactate accumulation can lead to discomfort in an athlete and then will become fatigue. In a study done on world-class endurance athletes, it was found that when the onset of blood lactate accumulation, or OBLA, set in, that the athlete's running economy was significantly deteriorated by a 2 millimole increase in lactate levels from 3 to 5 millimole per liter, with a raise in oxygen cost of 5.5% when running at their individual lactate threshold. This is a significant amount if you're taking in world-class endurance athletes. 5.5% oxygen costs can basically win or lose you a race because everything's so small. So I found that very interesting. And then in a separate study, it was found that an accumulation of lactate can lead to metabolic acidosis and an increase in hydrogen ions via lactate dissociation. This increase in hydrogen ions can inhibit glycolytic enzymes and hinder muscle contractions by competing with calcium to bind with troponin, which eventually may lead to fatigue. And that study was done by Lantis, Farrell, Contrell, and Larson in 2017, so that's pretty recent. Marcinick et al., for training adaptations, and this is what I touched on earlier, found that a strength training regimen improved endurance performance with a 12% increase in lactate threshold. So just by adding strength training to an endurance athlete, they gained a 12% increase in their lactate threshold. And they also found that the individual's endurance performance increased due to the increase in the lactate threshold as well as their leg strength. So supplementing a strength program with their endurance built up their lactate threshold, and they were able to compete longer without having a lactate accumulation. And then in the same study as we went over earlier, by Lantis, Farrell, Cantrell, and Larson in 2017, it basically backed up what Marcinick et al. Stated in 1991. They found that by supplementing endurance training with high volume resistance training, or HVRT, that delayed onset blood lactate accumulation at 4 millimole per liter and improved leg strength in the participating subjects. So by adding and supplementing a resistance training protocol with their endurance training, it delayed the onset of blood lactate accumulation. And if there's a delay in the onset of blood lactate accumulation, an athlete can perform longer at a higher intensity. That is my presentation, and thank you for watching.